Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
So, Gabby, we're not even 2 months into the new year, and by all means, I feel like this has been one of the busiest starts in terms of New Mexico news to a new year, at least that I can remember.
That's fair. I don't think in my tenure as an investigative reporter here, I've done so many quick turn investigations. I've been consumed a lot by the DWI scheme.
Absolutely. You
personally.
spent a lot of time covering the DWI dismissal scandal, and we've done a few episodes here on the podcast about it. But another big continued happening right now that we really have not gotten to here yet this year is as I call it, the annual meeting of the minds in Santa Fe, that of course being the state legislature. Aside from being a pronounced session for Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, this being her last 60-day session as New Mexico's chief executive, another name for me I felt kept popping up, and that would be the New Mexico Attorney General.
For sure. We consume ourselves with local news, and then I go home and read all the national news, and it's like, whoa, there's so much going on. Yeah. And certainly the AG's name comes up. So without further ado, let's just introduce our guest. New Mexico's Attorney General Raúl Torrez is joining us once again on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and you have obviously had a connection to some of the biggest legislation lawmakers are evaluating this term. Chris contends you also might be one of New Mexico's busiest elected officials right now.
Not the busiest. Well, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I don't. I know the men and women who go into the roundhouse every single day are really feeling the pressure, but we have taken on a lot inside the agency. One of the things that we set out as a goal for ourselves is to be in a position to not just follow, but to lead national litigation, especially in light of the possibility that there would be a second Trump administration and the possibility that would involve what we believe to be violations of the law and violation of various constitutional provisions. And so while we have obviously been engaged in the state level policymaking work that we've been doing for quite some time, both on public safety and consumer protection and other ways, at the same time, we were trying to build out this capacity to do cutting edge national level litigation. Last week, for the first time, I think in the state's history, New Mexico is leading a coalition of 14 states on a major constitutional question with respect to the activity of Elon Musk and DOGE and what we believe to be a violation of the Appointments Clause in the Constitution. And so we've been actively engaged in that work. But at the same time, while we're keeping an eye on the White House, we're keeping an eye on the Roundhouse and trying to keep all of those plates spinning. And it's no easy thing, so I'm not getting as much sleep as I probably should, but it's why we do the job.
It feels like a lot in February. But we want to get to some of those things. We'll do this sort of in layers. Sure. But some of the legislative efforts that you've had connection to, also some of the efforts in the court related to federal actions, we'll get to topically. Let's start with what we had originally, I think, called you about. It's a local story, and then things kept happening. But let's talk about the controversial multi-million-dollar buyout of the president's contract at Western New Mexico.
Yeah, and so this buyout, for those who haven't heard, we talked a little bit about it with the state auditor. That was actually before the buyout, but we talked a little bit about Western New Mexico University back when we interviewed him last year. Western New Mexico University, it's down in Silver City. They were subject to a special audit last year. The results showed that the now former university president, Joseph Shepard, spent nearly $250,000 on what the auditor's office deemed, quote, excessive or extravagant travel and lodging between 2018 and 2023. And there were other expenditures that were highlighted in that report. Eventually, because of that report, Shepard agrees to step down, but in the process, Western New Mexico University Regents, they greenlight this $2 million or nearly $2 million buyout, also agreeing as part of that buyout to give him an 8-month sabbatical and a job, a $200,000 a year job as a professor working remotely. It certainly does not feel like most university presidents get these types of offers. AG Torres, you took issue with this, your office did from the outset. You filed a lawsuit to intervene. What is wrong with this picture here? Why is this deal so problematic to you?
Well, when you engage in that kind of self-dealing and misuse of taxpayer funds, you should be fired, and you shouldn't walk away with one additional cent of the public's money. And instead, the Board of Regents at that institution felt that they had license to grant somebody that they clearly have a personal relationship with. Rather than firing him, they gave him a $2 million golden parachute. It's disgusting. And I can tell you, of all the things that we have done in my time as Attorney General, we have not received as much public outrage from constituents as what occurred at Western. And frankly, we were allowing the auditor's process and the State Ethics Commission to do its investigative work, and we hadn't stepped in because our role is to come in at the end of that investigation. But once the Regents announced that they were going to hand out this ludicrous $2 million buyout, we had to take action. What was pretty disappointing is that we clearly signaled to that university that we wanted that payment to stop. We couldn't get any contact from administrators inside the university because they were all on vacation. Turns out the only one who wasn't on vacation is the guy who cuts the check, because Shepard expedited his own payment. And so we weren't able to stop the issuance of the $2 million, but we've certainly continued and actually amended the complaint. And so we are pursuing our legal action in Silver City in district court to try to recover that money. We also proposed both a constitutional amendment and a separate bill.
Yeah, so just the fallout from that has been wild to watch. The governor called for the resignation of the university's Board of Regents. They obliged, but then since then, like you said, you've pushed to overhaul elements related to Regents' obligations and their financial responsibilities. So there are a couple of bills that you pushed lawmakers to address this session. Explain to us, what are you seeking?
Well, the first is a constitutional amendment, which is still pending in the House, which would clarify, frankly, something that probably shouldn't need clarification, but apparently these folks need it. It's that you have a fiduciary duty to taxpayers and to students and to the institutions themselves. And it also enables the legislature to change the process for removal. And actually, right now, the removal process for Board of Regents is to take them to the Supreme Court. We're asking for it to be a district court process that can be initiated by the Attorney General's office, and also to give the legislature greater leeway to craft new management and oversight. So that, fortunately, is still alive and well.
And that's the House Joint Resolution.
That's the House Joint Resolution that's still pending. Sadly, the Senate bill that was pending in front of the Senate Education Committee was tabled yesterday. And, I've been at this for quite some time. I have seen a number of bills that have pretty broad public support go down because of special interest lobbying. What happened yesterday was one of the most shameful things I've ever seen. Lobbyists who work for those institutions, who are themselves paid by taxpayers, succeeded in getting members of that committee to totally misunderstand the nature of the bill. They actually raised something, and I'll read it for you. They raised the prospect that it could jeopardize accreditation. And the language that they relied on was this. It comes from a national group. It says, in discharging its fiduciary duties, the institution's governing board is free from undue external influence, is empowered to act in the best interests of the institution, including the students it serves. That clearly is a reference to some kind of misconduct by an external third party. Well, the legislators and the lobbyists that are, again, being paid for by taxpayers came up with this argument that the Board of Finance is somehow going to be exerting undue influence over these institutions. And the bottom line is they tabled it. The higher ed secretary, who hasn't proposed a single alternative to this, showed up in opposition to the bill. No one on the committee came up with any solution to the bill. And so, the voters and the taxpayers are left with the status quo system. And, you get to a certain point where you start to wonder who the folks in Santa Fe are actually representing, who they're actually listening to. Because other than the lobbyists, I haven't heard a single citizen raise their hand and say, this is something that we're opposed to. And the same thing happened in a separate bill in the House. We had a package that we'd put together to try and protect victims of crime. Both of those bills were tabled, again, by special interest groups. And so, we're coming up on the halfway point pretty soon in the legislative session. And the lack of action on accountability for higher education is pretty disturbing. The lack of action in terms of much needed reforms to protect victims and put them on an equal playing field with criminal defendants in our criminal justice system is pretty disappointing. But sadly, it's not terribly surprising, because what happens in that building is that people who have outside special interest lobbyists have access to the policymaking process that obscures what the public actually wants. And look, in my role as Attorney General, I don't have necessarily a formal role to play in that process other than to offer ideas. I've been pretty disappointed, frankly, by the governor's administration and by the higher ed secretary for showing up and opposing that bill without offering meaningful reform. But, it's early in the process, and maybe we'll be surprised. But at the halfway mark, it's pretty disappointing.
So this was Senate Bill 266 that was tabled yesterday. You mentioned the accreditation portion of it. There was concerns that it would affect that. I know one of the other concerns that was brought up was this idea of hey, if you have a large contract from a university administrator and it has to go to the Department of Finance or the AG for review, it's going to take a long time and no one's going to want to apply for these jobs here. But yet, I think I go back to this idea of, is their satisfaction? It doesn't sound like it, because, you had the governor calling for the resignation of the entire Board of Regents. Is there satisfaction here with the status quo? So my question, I guess, is, can something change in New Mexico, or are we just sort of poised to do nothing after one of the biggest, most controversial university administrator buyouts on record?
Look, you would have to ask the people who tabled this bill what their alternative is. I mean, it's easy enough for people to show up and try to identify some piece of language in the bill as an excuse for doing nothing. I don't think the public, after what we witnessed at Western, is in the mood for the legislature to do nothing. At this point, that's what they look like they're going to do. And this point, take the example that you just raised. Oh, well, it would be, it would really hamper our ability to negotiate these contracts. The Board of Finance meets every month. I'm at work every day. So I don't think it's some undue burden for some senior level administrator who, by the way, the bill is only triggered when they propose paying that person more than 10 times the lowest paid worker at the institution. That's what this is about, right? This is why I keep raising the issue of the lobbyists. Who do you think the lobbyists who lobby on behalf of higher education institutions talk to? They talk to presidents. They talk to boards of regents. They don't talk to the janitor. They don't talk to teachers.
The highest paid employees.
They talk to the highest paid employees. So we're using taxpayer dollars to go and protect the interests of the highest paid employees, and the taxpayers have no lobbyists. The taxpayers have no voice in that room that has the same sort of level of clout in the process. And I guess what I would say to the folks who voted against this measure, you don't like it, fine. Where's your idea? And as far as I can tell, they don't have any, which signals to me that they're fine with the status quo. And if we keep doing that in New Mexico, and I say this frankly as a leader inside the Democratic Party, we had better stop ignoring the common sense, basic requests of people when it comes to crime, public safety, public accountability, how we're using taxpayer dollars. We need to put the voice of everyday citizens front and center, and not the special interest groups that dominate inside that building.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms. Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Let's move on to one of the other elements lawmakers are looking at, that being CYFD. 2 years ago, you moved to create a civil rights division within your office. One of the elements you noted would be how the office works towards protecting children, right? While also noting, and I quote, you told us, New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department has failed to protect kids in our state. Here we are in 2025. There are multiple efforts from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to now overhaul CYFD. Some have called for a new oversight office. The governor has suggested her own idea for outside oversight. Others are calling for a different way to select a leader of CYFD. It's hard for us, Chris and I, to not think of, we were just talking about this a couple of years ago. What are your thoughts about what lawmakers are trying to do now?
Well, look, it's one of those issues where there are a lot of different competing proposals. And I frankly, I don't have a lot of respect for the proposal that was submitted by the governor. It seems, again, to be something where we appoint another task force or another committee to submit another report card on an agency we already know is failing. I am a strong proponent of a real Office of the Child Advocate, but that office needs to have the ability to refer systemic failures to the Department of Justice, to the New Mexico Department of Justice, so that if those failures aren't corrected, we have the ability to take legal action. We are already formulating a separate legal action with respect to the confidentiality provisions of the Children's Code, which frankly I think violate the First Amendment. And so that will be forthcoming probably in the weeks and months ahead. But I have yet to see a proposal in Santa Fe that has real teeth and real enforcement in it. I applaud their, the attention that they're giving to this agency. I think it's long overdue. But anything that results in another blue ribbon commission detailing the failures, right? We don't need that anymore. We got kids getting killed. We got kids getting hurt. We got people, teachers, and family members calling that agency thinking that some child is going to be rescued, and they're not. And there needs to be real accountability and consequences attached to that. So I hope that those proposals include, that kind of enforcement, but I think we'll have to wait and see.
I wanted to talk just a little bit more about some of these proposals. You mentioned the governor's proposal. Just pulling from her State of the State address, she had said, I'm proposing a partnership with an independent outside expert in child welfare and foster care, such as those at the Urban Institute, to evaluate CYFD's performance in conjunction with our state auditor and report their findings to the executive and legislative branches of the state every 6 months. So that's her idea.
So we're going to have a report card of failure every 6 months. What does that do? Right.
The idea just being a continued report and evaluation with not necessarily any teeth. The Office of Child Advocate, that is in a bill. I know we've done a story about that, kind of a bipartisan effort. You've seen Republicans and Democrats sign on to endorse that bill. I don't have a status update on it right now, but I do know that it has had at least one committee hearing. And that was one of the things that you were saying. You feel like you should see, but the key there, I know that bill would give them subpoena power, so they'd be able to, court enforceably grab somebody and say, hey, please come and talk to us about said thing we're investigating. But you're saying the real power lies with whether or not they have the referral power to essentially an agency that can file things in court.
Well, part of the challenge that we have right now is that we have, and this is part of the reason that we're going to be focused on the legal infirmity inside the Children's Code. We have a federal law that requires a certain level of confidentiality as a condition of receiving federal funds. And that was intended at inception to try and protect the privacy interests of the kids who are in the system. And that makes total sense. But instead of just redacting the identifiable information relative to the kids, what we have done is created an entire shield for one of the most incompetent and mismanaged agencies in the history of the state. And so it's a blanket shield. Anybody who's done any reporting on CYFD, anybody can tell you that the minute you send in an IPRA that says, I'd like to know about this case and what happened, what do you get? Sorry, we can't tell you because so
for the children's code.
Yeah, right. And here's the quiet part out loud. They pretend that they're doing that because they care so much about the privacy interests of children. They do that because it allows them to shield their own incompetence. And that has to stop. And the other piece is, I don't have any problems with reports and, national experts. That's great. I don't need a national expert to tell me what a person on the street already knows, which is a broken, failed institution and enough already, right? So it's time to get our act together as a state, give the enforcement authority that this agency needs to go after these people and start hauling cabinet secretaries into court. I don't need them to have another round and round conversation with some, advisory committee in the legislature or the executive branch. They need to stand in front of a judge and explain to the judge what they're doing or failing to do to protect our kids.
And we've done investigative reporting about those advisory committees, just, people coming to us, journalists, saying we're not being listened to. We're voicing concerns and nothing is happening. And then to your point about the children's code, as a journalist, trying to get records when a child has died, we also come up with the children's code. You talk about, that was in place to protect the privacy of a child when that child is dead. And we're trying to do the anatomy of the case. What happened? How can we prevent this? It's really hard to get records in New Mexico.
Well, and the thing is, if you can get records, it's usually when a child has died, right? Those are the cases that because of law enforcement's involvement, because of there's independent sources of information, you're able to actually piece together that this child was killed, and then work backwards from there that there's a CYFD referral. Do you know how many kids there are in the system that haven't died, but that have been abused again, molested again, left in the home of a drug-addicted parent or somebody who is unqualified to supervise? It happens all the time. And you never know about it, and you never see it. And I think once we unmask this, it's going to be pretty hard for this administration or, frankly, the legislature to continue to turn a blind eye to the problem.
This is obviously not your first time in the legislature. You've spent years haggling with lawmakers over criminal code reforms. Yeah. This year, they do seem to be moving forward with an omnibus crime package, which is headlined with changes to competency law and civil commitment procedures as well. I've done a lot of reporting about these topics. What are your thoughts on this attempt to address criminal competency, which seems, again, to have gathered support after the murder of a Las Cruces police officer last year?
Yeah, so I think these are all positive steps, right? These are things that should happen. But I think people should temper their expectations. This is not the proposal that police and prosecutors would put together, right? In other words, this is not the proposal that frontline law enforcement professionals think should be at the top of our list. It's not to say that we shouldn't have these tools. We should, but they're short quite a few proposals. I share DA Bregman's concern about the lack of accountability in the children's code for the startling increase that we are seeing in violent juvenile offenders. I continue to be disappointed in the lack of action on stopping the revolving door and the complacency that has sort of set in that institution about, telling everyone that this is not a problem, it is not an issue, leaning on cooked up studies and cooked up numbers to sort of justify a fatal flaw in our system. Now, that doesn't mean I won't support the public safety package, but at this point, it's more window dressing than substantive in my view. And if it added new essential elements to give police and prosecutors the tools they needed, I'd probably have a stronger view on it. But at this point, I think they're probably doing what they think they can do given the composition of the body.
Some other elements of this omnibus crime package include changes to fentanyl trafficking penalties, vehicle theft sentencing changes, DWI changes specifically to highlight cannabis, as we know that's become a legal recreational industry here in the state. Do you feel that way as well? This sort of window dressing. These are addressing, or an attempt to address, what seems like, they are components of criminal activity in New Mexico, but
right.
Perhaps they're not the biggest one.
No, the biggest one is, number one, do a whole lot more to support law enforcement officers to join these departments, to dig into why it is they're having such a difficult time recruiting officers. In this city, you have, you're several hundred officers short. You have been for years. That is probably the single biggest element in terms of public safety that needs to be addressed. Number two, if you catch somebody with a gun and they're connected and they're charged with a felony, here's a crazy idea. Why don't we try keeping that person in jail? Why don't we try keeping people who are repeat offenders in jail? It is sort of astonishing for me as a prosecutor to look at this process and know what the most obvious answer is in the equation, and yet really smart people in the legislature will do everything they can to come up with 15 other things to try before they do the obvious thing. I know the chief of police has this perspective. I know the prosecutors that I worked and supervised have this perspective. Keep bad guys in jail, crime will go down. It's not that complicated. It's not that hard. It's just when it comes to the roundhouse and their political inability to move on those issues that it becomes a challenge.
And is that the rebuttable presumption statute to you, the one where essentially if you get charged with a certain list of violent crimes, serious crimes, it is incumbent on you and your attorney as the suspect to make the case as to why you shouldn't be in jail instead of always placing the burden on prosecutors?
Yeah, and I will take, like, one of my biggest mistakes, and I've made a few, but one of my biggest mistakes in public life was to repeat a phrase that is in everyday use in federal court in every state in America, and it's something that we use every single day, and that was the notion of a rebuttable presumption of detention. Right now, today, you could go down to the federal district court. They will have somebody in federal custody. A federal prosecutor will stand up. A judge will look at this person. They'll have all their due process rights, and the hearing will take 10 minutes, and 90% of the time, if they have a gun and a felony, they're going to jail. The messaging at the state level was both mismanaged by others who didn't understand what a rebuttable presumption is, but also weaponized, again, by people, by special interest groups who try to shift the constitutional landscape in their favor. But it's an obvious solution to an obvious problem. It's just not the way politics in New Mexico seems to be working right now. I hope that changes, but until we get serious about those things, I don't think the marginal things that are included in this public safety package are really going to get the job done.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
When you talk about the political landscape in New Mexico, obviously we know we're a pretty blue state, but even when we think about like the competency law reform and things that we've been discussing here, I think the argument that I hear a lot from, civil rights advocates are the fear of taking away somebody's civil rights, right, to be presumed innocent, or like when we talk about competency, the idea of court ordering somebody into long-term treatment instead of voluntarily leaving it up to them.
Sure.
It's not always working.
Sure.
What's your perspective on that sort of, I guess, political landscape in New Mexico?
Well, I think a couple of points. First, set aside the special interest groups that you talk to. Talk to the public. Talk to members of the public. Poll these issues with people. and see what they think. Because I think one of the biggest issues, which I've highlighted in a couple of different ways, but it's certainly not, the only examples we can use, is we're supposed to live in a representative democracy where we represent constituents and people who elected us to office. And what's happening is these groups have started to dominate the narrative and dominate the policy agenda, but they don't actually have widespread political support. That's a problem. And frankly, it's part of the reason that Democrats lost the presidential election last year, is they kept listening to groups instead of listening to people about what people wanted. We have to stop doing that. We have to stop telling people, oh, there really isn't a crime problem. Let me listen to my experts, and they'll explain to you that there really isn't a public safety problem. Or the economy's great. Just listen to my experts. They'll tell you how great the economy is. We have to get out of that business. Second, with respect to the legal aspects of your question, other states don't seem to have the same trouble that we have. Other states seem to manage their public safety and sort of behavioral health system in ways that are both constitutional, but better balance the priorities and needs of the general public. I have yet to meet anyone who is in favor of letting people live in the park year after year, day after day, with this raging addiction or behavioral health issue, and the notion that they should be allowed to live in that space and probably feed their habit by engaging in lower level crime without consequence. There are very few citizens who think that's an acceptable balance of personal and private rights and the general public good. And yet the opponents of the what I believe to be sort of common sense measures to protect the public, they go to extremes, right? One of the dirty little secrets in this space is oftentimes there are places for folks to go. If you go there, you can't use drugs. So we have to come to grips with whether or not somebody's inability to break free of a substance abuse disorder should mean that the rest of us have to walk into every store with everything locked up, or if we have to go to every park and there's nothing but tents there, or we have to have somebody down and out in front of our business. That we didn't used to live in that society. We used to be able to balance the private interests and the individual rights of certain people with the needs of everyone else. And so we are living through a society where we're living with the consequences where we have lost sight of the appropriate balance to be struck between those two competing goals.
Yeah. We also know you have kept busy in the realm of federal action. Your office has filed multiple actions lately against the Trump administration related to funding for medical and public health research and the federal funding freeze, the work of the Department of Government Efficiency, also known as Elon Musk's DOGE. Can you walk us through some of your arguments against these orders and where do things stand today?
So yeah, we've joined litigation challenging the president's decision to try and end birthright citizenship, cuts to the NIH, unilateral freezes through an OMB memo that was sent across the government. But the latest, and the one that we're actually leading rather than joining others, is a lawsuit that was filed last week, which states very clearly that the President of the United States does not have the power to create a whole new department and then to place at the head of that department somebody who's not been subjected to the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, I know this is complicated constitutional stuff, and part of my job is to ground the public's understanding of core institutions in our historical and traditional understandings of the law. But the way to think about it is simply this. What's America's origin story? It starts with a group of people who realize that placing the power of the state in the hands of a single unelected individual is something that we're not comfortable with, and we haven't been cool with it since 1776. We actually had a war over it, right? And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that they listed in that declaration was the repeated behavior of the king creating new offices and filling those offices with whoever he wanted without any input from the elected representatives of the people. So when we crafted the Constitution, we actually designed the Constitution to prohibit that, to prevent that from happening. What I worry about is not just the immediate impact that Elon Musk is having right now in accessing the sensitive data of New Mexico's citizens, or cutting off payments, or firing people, or disrupting services. Those are all policy decisions that are going to have huge implications for our state and for our people. But there is a much, much bigger issue at stake, and that is the extent to which we are willing to let our constitutional boundaries erode and place someone like this in a position where they have unfettered access and unfettered control over what appears to be every element inside the federal government. I mean, at last count, it was something like 17 agencies, federal agencies, that had been penetrated by DOGE. And I know there are going to be people who listen and says, well, the president, he got elected, he gets to do this. It's not actually true, right? It's not actually part of our framework. There is a constitutional way for the president to enact these policies. It requires him to go to his allies, who now run not just the House, but also the Senate, and say, I want to feed this agency to the wood chipper, right? And I want to create this new super agency that has the power to do all of these other things. If Congress goes in and blesses that action, I may not agree with it from a policy perspective, but it would be a constitutional way to engage in this. But sitting behind the resolute desk and just issuing commands, that's what monarchs do. That's not what presidents in a constitutional republic do. And so I'm sure every president, Democrat and Republican, both in the past, but more importantly in the future, would love the ability to just wipe away, or in Elon Musk's words, delete entire federal agencies. But the question people need to ask is whether or not we are comfortable handing that much power to an unelected billionaire with little or no oversight and with little or no training or understanding in how these programs or systems work. You know, one of the things I keep telling people is he comes from a place where the ethos is move fast and break things. That may be great for Twitter. I don't really care if he moves fast and breaks Twitter. I care profoundly if he moves fast and breaks the Department of Education or the NIH or the FAA or the Department of Defense, because real people's lives are at stake and the national security of this country is at stake.
We know you mentioned this just previously in your answer there, that New Mexico has a lot of tie-in to the federal government, and the changes that may come from a Trump administration seemingly, based on everything that's been projected, stand to affect New Mexico. And I just wanted to ask from your perspective, I know it's, to be clear, you're an elected state official, and so maybe perhaps don't have the whole background breadth of the federal investment in New Mexico, but we all know it's clear that there is a big tie-in here. From your perspective, how much does New Mexico stand to change amid the actions of the Trump administration when it comes to industry, jobs, the people that fill a lot of these federal agencies working here in New Mexico?
Well, listen, we obviously have a number of dedicated, hardworking people who go to work on behalf of their country every single day. And, first, I will say on a personal level, I'm the son of a career federal prosecutor. So I find it profoundly offensive for people who have spent most of their lives enriching themselves to turn around and try and point a finger at people who have done nothing but try and serve their country and protect and uphold the best traditions of their communities. We have to get out of that business. It's okay for people to be upset with government bureaucracy and waste and fraud, all of those things. And there is an important role for government leaders in both parties to engage in, to make government more effective, make it more efficient, make it more responsive to the needs and interests of taxpayers. But at the end of the day, when you fire these people, you're at war with yourself. You're at war with members of your community. You're at war with a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's what that means. And that means people that work for the Forest Service, people that work for the Indian Health Service, people that work at the national labs. I mean, we're watching now the Trump administration and these DOGE bros suddenly figuring out that, oh, wait, we fired guys who are responsible for safeguarding our nuclear arsenal and safeguarding like the national security protocols for how we deal with the nuclear weapons that we create. What are we doing? I mean, that's craziness. Now, again, there is a way to go about this work, and it's been done in the past. Bill Clinton engaged in a pretty broad restructuring and efficiency program to try and bring things down. I know other Republican administrations have done the same, but be mindful about it. Be smart about it. Cutting cancer research, cutting Alzheimer's research, cutting funding to national security installations, deciding unilaterally, we're just going to purge the government of all of these individuals without regard to what it is that they do. That seems reckless. And I also think, and this is a really important point, I don't know that the American people voted for that. I mean, if you really dig into what people were voting for, I know they're frustrated with government, and they have every right to expect more from their government, but I don't think they conceived of or endorse an approach that is stupid and unconstitutional and takes a sledgehammer to programs that impact people not just around the world, but all across the United States. I mean, you cut off USAID because we decided we spend too much money trying to help starving children on the other side of the world, because that's what makes us great, apparently, is cutting off aid to starving children. Well, you're also cutting off contracts to American farmers who grow the food to feed the starving children. I wonder how the farmers feel, thinking that they actually had a deal with their government to sell that food, and suddenly they can't anymore. I mean, that's the kind of stupidity that has to be called out, and I have every intention of using the power that I have in this office to not only hold the people in Santa Fe accountable, but hold the people in Washington, D.C. accountable too.
Yeah, and that's ultimately the work of your office and other attorneys general across the nation. Right now we see them taking these issues to court. So before we let you go, I know you have a busy schedule, but I have to ask you about this DWI dismissal scheme, because as I mentioned off the top, it's consumed most of my bandwidth this year as far as local investigative reporting. Obviously, that is an ongoing investigation led by the feds, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, which actually new news this week. He was just informed that he needed to step down per the President Trump's request, which is a normal thing when a new president takes over. They kind of want to put their own U.S. attorneys in office. But as the New Mexico Attorney General, are there any state charges that officers could face as a result of this?
Potentially, but what I will say is that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office has not included us in the information that they developed in the course of that investigation. And as a former federal prosecutor, I totally respect that, because quite frankly, they have a more effective and efficient criminal justice system. So I think that makes sense for them to continue to do that. What I will say is, if for some reason the U.S. Attorney's Office closed that investigation without bringing it to a resolution that I think is supported by all of the evidence, we would certainly take a look at it, but we haven't been asked to do that. My sense is that the public and everyone who has been sort of impacted by this scandal is their right to be disillusioned, their right to be frankly ashamed and skeptical about what has gone on in that department. And as I understand it now, spreading into other departments, in the revelation that came out recently with the guilty plea by one of the sort of the main targets in the investigation was that this has gone back all the way to 1995. I mean, when I was in high school. So it's a real stain on law enforcement and public safety, and that's why it's essential that we support the U.S. Attorney's Office's efforts to get to the bottom of it and clean it out and hold people accountable, and then allow those agencies to rebuild their reputations and make sure that we have processes in place to make sure something like this never happens again. I mean, it's a real sad day for New Mexico law enforcement when something like that happens.
Certainly a lot of different topics we've hit you with here today, and we appreciate all of your perspective here. Attorney General Raúl Torrez, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Again, a thanks to Attorney General Raúl Torrez of the New Mexico Department of Justice. Certainly one of the busiest departments out there right now, just based on the Attorney General's legal actions that he is launching into here now.
And 2025 has been a rapid start to the year on all fronts, both locally and nationally. But if you all have any story ideas, always feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and GBurkNM on social media.
And I'm Chris.McKee@krqe.com, also at Chris McKee TV. You can watch our full conversation at krqe.com/podcasts, and also leave us a comment on Spotify. Thanks for listening and watching.